Something explosive happened right after the first race of the 2026 Formula One season. Mercedes didn't just win the Australian Grand Prix. They dominated it. Pole position, fastest race pace, and a powerful 1-2 finish with George Russell in first and Kimi Antonelli right behind him. But only hours after that victory in Melbourne, the mood inside the paddock suddenly changed. Because rival teams started analyzing the race data, and they did not like what they saw. Acceleration numbers that looked unusually strong. Energy deployment patterns that engineers did not expect under the new regulations. And performance spikes that some analysts believe could be worth nearly 30 extra horsepower in certain moments of the lap. 30 horsepower. In Formula One, that kind of advantage can decide an entire championship. Ferrari has already admitted they were nowhere near Mercedes during the Australian weekend. Red Bull finished more than 50 seconds behind the leaders. And now, several teams are reportedly furious about the performance of the Mercedes power unit. So furious, in fact, that the FIA has begun looking deeper into the data coming from the W17 engine after the Australian Grand Prix. Because if Mercedes has discovered a hidden interpretation of the new 2026 engine regulations, then the performance we saw in Melbourne might only be the beginning of a much bigger story. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the Mercedes engine has suddenly become the most talked about piece of technology in the entire Formula One paddock, and why this investigation could change the direction of the 2026 championship before the next race even begins. The race in Melbourne did not begin as the comfortable Mercedes victory that the final result might suggest. In fact, the first seconds of the Australian Grand Prix looked very different. George Russell started from pole position. Kimi Antonelli was right beside him on the front row. Everything seemed perfectly set for Mercedes to control the race from the very beginning. But when the lights went out, both Mercedes drivers struggled to launch cleanly. Charles Leclerc reacted faster and immediately jumped into the lead heading into the first corner. For several laps, it looked like Ferrari might actually control the race. Russell and Leclerc began exchanging positions in a fierce early battle. And that fight revealed something important about the new 2026 regulations. Every time Russell activated the new overtake mode, the Mercedes suddenly surged forward with impressive acceleration. The car looked extremely powerful down the straights. But there was a trade-off. Deploying that extra electrical energy drained the battery quickly. And once the battery level dropped, Leclerc had the opportunity to fight back. So the early laps turned into a fascinating cycle. Attack, counterattack, recharge, then attack again. It was one of the first clear examples of how the new hybrid rules are changing the way drivers battle on track. But hidden inside that battle was a small detail that engineers would later notice when they examined the telemetry from the race. Every time the Mercedes released electrical energy, the acceleration looked slightly stronger than its rivals. Not dramatically stronger, but consistent. Out of slow corners, the Mercedes seemed to gain just a little bit more speed than the cars around it. At the time, that detail did not attract much attention. After all, Mercedes had already arrived in Australia with rumors about a very strong new power unit. But a few laps later, the race reached the moment that completely changed the outcome. A virtual safety car was triggered when the Red Bull of Isaac Hadjar stopped on track with a mechanical failure. And in that exact moment, Mercedes made the decision that defined the entire race. Both Russell and Antonelli entered the pit lane at the same time. A perfectly synchronized double pit stop under the virtual safety car. That single move gave them fresh tires while losing almost no time compared to the cars that stayed on track. Ferrari chose not to pit at that moment. At the time, it looked like a reasonable gamble. But when the race restarted, Russell suddenly had something extremely valuable. Clean air ahead of him. And that is when the real pace of the Mercedes became impossible to ignore. Lap after lap, Russell began controlling the race from the front. He did not need to push aggressively. The car looked balanced, stable, and incredibly efficient with tire management and energy deployment. Behind him, Antonelli began climbing back through the field after his poor start. Within a few laps, the young Italian had recovered enough positions to move back into second place. By the final phase of the race, the picture was clear. Russell leading comfortably. Antonelli protecting second place. Ferrari unable to close the gap. The race finished with a dominant Mercedes 1-2. The perfect start to the 2026 season. But while the Mercedes garage celebrated that result, something very different was happening in the garages of their rivals. Because engineers had already started analyzing the race data. Every acceleration zone. Every deployment of electrical energy. Every moment where the Mercedes seemed to gain time. And once those numbers were compared with the telemetry from Ferrari and Red Bull, one question began spreading quietly across the paddock. How is the Mercedes engine producing acceleration like that under the new regulations? And the next part of this story explains why that question has now reached the FIA, and why several teams are reportedly furious after what they saw in the data from Australia. But the real tension inside the paddock did not start during the race. It started after the race. Because once engineers began comparing the telemetry from the Australian Grand Prix, the numbers from the Mercedes power unit immediately stood out. Not in top speed, not in cornering performance, but in the short acceleration phases. Those moments when the driver exits a slow corner and the hybrid system releases electrical energy to push the car forward. Albert Park has many corners like that. And every time the Mercedes reached those points, the acceleration curve looked slightly stronger than the rest of the grid. Just a small difference. A few hundredths of a second. But repeated again and again across the lap. When engineers overlaid the data from Mercedes with the telemetry from Ferrari and Red Bull, the pattern became difficult to ignore. The Mercedes was gaining tiny advantages in almost every traction zone. And those tiny advantages were adding up. Over one lap, it meant a few tenths. Over a full race distance, it meant control of the race. That is exactly what George Russell demonstrated in Melbourne. Once he moved into clean air after the virtual safety car pit stop, he did not need to push the car to the limit. He simply managed the pace from the front. The Mercedes was fast enough to maintain a stable gap to Ferrari while protecting the tires and the battery. But once rival engineers began studying those acceleration curves, frustration started to grow. Because under the 2026 regulations, electrical deployment is strictly controlled. Every team operates within the same limits for energy recovery and energy release. So when one power unit suddenly appears significantly more efficient in those moments, the obvious question appears. How are they doing it? Some analysts inside the paddock now believe the Mercedes power unit could have an advantage of roughly 30 horsepower in certain acceleration phases. In Formula 1 terms, that number is enormous. Even 10 additional horsepower can change the competitive balance between teams. 30 horsepower can transform the entire grid. And that possibility is exactly why several teams reacted so strongly after the race in Australia. Ferrari was surprisingly open about the situation. Charles Leclerc admitted that Ferrari was nowhere near the pace of the Mercedes during the weekend. He explained that even with a perfect lap in qualifying, the gap would still have been significant because Mercedes had found a huge amount of performance from the engine. Red Bull reached a similar conclusion. Max Verstappen finished 6th in Melbourne, more than 50 seconds behind the winning Mercedes. For a team that dominated previous seasons, that result was extremely unusual. And inside the paddock, the message from rival teams has become increasingly clear. They believe Mercedes has discovered something inside the new engine regulations that the rest of the grid has not yet fully understood. That does not automatically mean anything illegal has happened. Formula 1 has always rewarded teams that interpret the rules more creatively than their rivals. Many of the greatest technical innovations in the sport started exactly like this. One team finds a smarter way to use the regulations. The others struggle to catch up. Or the FIA steps in to clarify the rules. Right now, the governing body is carefully reviewing the data from the Australian Grand Prix to understand exactly how the Mercedes power unit is delivering its performance. And that is why the atmosphere inside the paddock has suddenly become so tense. Because if the advantage we saw in Melbourne comes from a clever interpretation of the regulations, Mercedes may have just given itself a huge head start in the 2026 championship. But if the FIA decides that the system pushes the rules too far, the consequences could be enormous for the rest of the season. And that is exactly why the investigation into the Mercedes engine is now becoming one of the biggest stories of the new Formula 1 era. And this is exactly where the situation becomes even more serious for the rest of the grid. Because when one team suddenly appears this strong at the beginning of a new regulation era, the other teams do not just watch quietly. They start asking questions. Lots of questions. Inside the paddock after the Australian Grand Prix, engineers from several teams reportedly began discussing the same possibility. What if Mercedes has discovered a clever interpretation of the new engine regulations? Something hidden in the way the hybrid system manages energy deployment. Because the 2026 power unit rules are extremely complex. They define exactly how much electrical energy can be recovered, how much can be deployed, and when that deployment can happen during the lap. But like every Formula 1 rulebook, the details leave room for interpretation. Sometimes that interpretation leads to innovation. Other times it leads to controversy. And right now, many engineers believe the Mercedes advantage might come from something deeper than just raw engine power. It may come from how the engine delivers that power. According to several technical analysts, the Mercedes power unit seems capable of releasing electrical energy in very short, extremely efficient bursts. Not for an entire straight, but for the exact moments when acceleration matters most. Right when the driver exits a corner. Right when the rear tires are finding traction. Right when the car begins building speed. If the timing of that deployment is perfect, the gains can be enormous. And that is exactly what the telemetry from Melbourne appears to show. The Mercedes was not just faster. It was smarter with its power, delivering energy at the precise moment when it produced the maximum performance gain. That kind of advantage does not always come from mechanical hardware. Very often, it comes from software. From the algorithms that control how the hybrid system behaves during every phase of the lap. And software-driven advantages are some of the hardest to replicate in Formula One. Even if rival teams understand what Mercedes is doing, reproducing that level of energy management could take months of development. Which means Mercedes could potentially enjoy a huge head start in the championship. And that is exactly why the FIA is now studying the data from the Australian Grand Prix so carefully. Because the governing body needs to understand one thing. Is Mercedes simply operating at the absolute limit of the regulations? Or have they discovered a loophole that gives them a performance advantage the rules never intended? Right now, nobody has that answer. But one thing is already clear. The first race of the 2026 season has triggered a technical mystery that could shape the entire championship. Because if Mercedes truly has found a smarter way to exploit the new hybrid regulations, the dominant performance we saw in Australia might only be the beginning. And that possibility is exactly what has the rest of the Formula One paddock watching the FIA investigation very closely.